And now I've loaded into our scene just an object that I have called rock sub D. And if we take a look at this object in Modeler, we can just see a very simple box that's been knifed a couple of times or divided into a couple of different segments and then slightly jittered. And then we have subdivision surfaces turned on for this object. And this can be found within the content folder, and that way you can load it in yourself and take a look at it in the scene. And what we want to do is first use this object as an emitter. So what I'm going to do is make sure our object is selected, and I can hit P on the keyboard to open up our properties. And if we go to the Dynamics tab, what we can do is add in emitter for our dynamic. And now this object has become an emitter. It has also automatically changed our nozzle to object surface, which means it's using our object surface to generate our particles. In other words, it's using the vertices that we have on our object in order to generate each of these particles. And if I switch our view mode from texture shaded to wireframe, of course, since it's a subdivided object, it's going to be a little more difficult to see. So what we can do is reduce that to just a regular object to take a look at that a little bit later. But what we're seeing right now is all of our particles are being generated by the points on our object. I'm going to increase our timeline to 350 frames, and our birth rate I'm going to set to 150, and this is going to be per second, and I want to change our particle limit to 100,000. Now we can see all of these particles being created. We also want to make sure they last throughout the duration of the animation. So we can change our lifetime to 350. And now we can scrub through and just see that overall generation. Now we also have object vertices, and this is going to be more specifically on the direct points of our object. And we can also see, if we take a look, that it is expanding throughout each of the points as it generates and moves along through our surface, almost as if it's highlighting the polygons. We could change this to normals, and then this will generate directly from our polygons. And then we have object surface, and we can also use object line. And this is going to be generated a little bit differently because we're working with a sub D object. So we're going to change this back to object surface, which is what is going to work best specifically for this object. And now right now we're not seeing a whole lot going on within the scene. We could add a little bit of motion to our particles, so we can select the motion tab. And then under explosion, let's add in a value of 3. And now we're going to see particles exploding from this object. And they're going to be coming directly from the object surface. So they're starting in the correct areas. And that way we can easily use this to have it generated correctly. If we wanted to have a hypervoxel object sort of mimicking the overall shape. And also if we take a look just at the particles, how they're being generated, we can see that it does outline the overall look of the object. And we can see that a little bit better if I increase our birth rate. So I'm going to increase that up to 1,000. And now if we scrub through a little, we can see the shape of our object a little bit better. I'm going to go into our resistance and go ahead and turn that down. I'm going to go back to motion and set our explosion down to 1 so that it's not a very large effect or so quick. But we can see how it's definitely outlining, so it is using our surface. Now typically, this kind of creation isn't all that spectacular, and really the best thing we can use these objects for is, of course, with the animation and motion of our object. I'm going to turn our explosion down to 0 right now. We scrub through and we'll just see our particles being created. Turn down our birth rate so we don't have so many in the scene. We'll just change that down to 250. And what I want to do is just create a little bit of motion with this object. Just some straightforward animation first, just adjusting our position, and then we can add some rotation later. So let's just start with our object on the right side of our screen, and as we move to frame 350, I am going to move our object over to the left, and we can see that our particles are staying in the same place, but that's because we haven't really refreshed the timeline. And I'm just going to move this down. And now I want to set this to the first frame in the animation, and we can start to scrub through. And we're seeing that some of our particles are being left behind, but overall they're just kind of being generated on the surface, and they're not really moving around too much. And that has to do with the effects that we have currently set to this. If we change this to object line and then take a look, we're going to notice a reduction of the amount of particles that are being created, and still pretty much the same sort of an effect. So let's take a look at some of the motion. I'm going to turn on vibration and set the value to 1. And I can calculate. And now we're noticing the object is moving. And some of the particles are left behind, but overall, they're moving along with our object. And whether or not we want it to be generated like that, we can also use the world coordinates, which will still produce basically the same sort of an effect. Go ahead and turn that off. But mainly, it's because our particle resistance is off that we're not seeing the trail left behind. So let's go ahead and turn back on our particle resistance to 1, which will influence our particles to kind of stay in place where they were originally generated, which means they'll follow along with the path of our object. So now if I calculate, we'll see that resistance really taking part, and our objects and particles will stay basically where they were created. And that's kind of a neat effect where we could have maybe an asteroid coming in or a comet in space with a trail on it, but we would want to have a little bit more motion with those particles. So what I can do is increase or decrease our resistance. I'm going to bring that down to 0.5, and we can calculate. And now we can see the particles are slightly moving along with our object. And we get kind of a neat effect. I'm going to add a little bit of explosion and set that to 1 and calculate. And now we're going to have our particles exploding offward from the surface, and then also with the resistance kind of staying behind. And this is a good way to generate fire engulfing a rock. And we could use a hypervoxel surface that's billowing in order to demonstrate that a little bit more, and that could create something fairly interesting. What I am going to do is increase the distance that this rock is going to be traveling throughout the animation, so I'll go ahead and bring this over to the left a little bit more, and then we can change our perspective view so we can see that a little bit better. I'll go ahead and calculate that, and now we can watch moving a little bit further and a little bit faster, but still basically the same sort of an effect. And what I want to do is just reduce that explosion down to 0.4. We could increase the vibration maybe, to 1.2 to give a little more variation. We can see it's not going to be expanding too far from the surface now of our object. And we end up with a pretty neat looking effect, but this object is still pretty much stationary. So let's go ahead and add a little bit of rotation towards the end or on our last frame to make this object kind of rotate throughout the scene. So we'll go ahead and switch to our rotation, which I'm using the scroll button for on the mouse. Otherwise you could just hit Y on the keyboard, and T will allow you to move, Y to rotate, and then we can also use the scroll button in order to change back and forth between each of the different transformations. And I want to just go ahead and give it a little bit of forward rotation using the bank. And now I'm going to recalculate, and we can take a look at how it's nicely flowing off our surface, even with the rotation. And it gives us a pretty neat looking effect. If we increase the explosion amount and calculate that a little bit more, we see a nice billowing effect, and it is going to build up more in certain areas because of the overall surface and how it is varied. So we can see it starts to compress a little bit smaller because the surface area where it generated right there was a little bit smaller at that point because, of course, this object has a bit of stretching on it, and it is larger on one side than it is on the other. Now, if we were working with a much larger explosion amount, we would see particles kind of flying off in different directions. So let's go ahead and increase the explosion amount up to 4, and then hit calculate. And now what we're going to see is the way that these are being propelled from the surface is going to be greatly affected by the overall rotation of the object. And of course, the more speed we have on that rotation and the faster it is rotating, the more we're going to notice these things kind of spraying off in directions that may not look correct. And part of that has to do with our resistance as well. So if we reduce our resistance a little bit more, let's go ahead and bring that down to 0.25 and then hit calculate, we'll notice these objects flowing out a lot farther, filling in more of an area, and because of that rotation, the overall effect of that. So let's increase our rotation even more on our pitch or our bank, create something a little bit faster, and now calculate that, and we can see much more rotation and the way that this is working as a generator kind of flowing off of our object. And we end up with a pretty neat looking effect that way. And let's go back to our motion options, and under explosion change that back down to a lower amount, and we can recalculate. And now we can really see that variation based on the size of our object and its position once it reaches the point where it's moving longer towards the path. So that's one thing to keep in mind while you're working on this sort of an effect, is whether or not you want to use the explosion to simulate them flowing off the surface, or whether you'd rather use vibration. Because if we reduce our explosion to 0 and increase our vibration to 3, and now recalculate, we're going to see something a little bit different. And now instead of them sort of shooting off the object, they're kind of rolling along with it for what's left behind. And this would be a much better way to animate something, maybe if this was an asteroid or a comet with a trail that would be rotating, and we get a much better flow off of our object with these particles. Now, because this emitter is the same as any other emitter that we could have in the scene, we could also apply gravity effects to this and different wind options. So I'm going to go ahead to the Dynamics tab and just add in a bit of gravity. And we're just going to stick with the defaults. And I can close that out, open up Object Properties, and hit Calculate. And now we're going to see the particles will react to that gravity. And the same they would if we were to add any sort of wind object and anything within that group. And of course, remember the default group will affect every object in every group in the scene. And I'm just going to remove this wind object, or sorry, this gravity object from our scene. And now what I can also do is create a texture for our generator. So our birth rate, we're going to change. Procedural texture, increase the contrast. And we want to adjust our size correctly to match our scene. So I'm going to do 2 meters on all of our axes. And I also want to increase the birth rate a little bit higher, up to 500. And let's calculate. And now we're going to see it flowing off the surface along with our texture that's basically applied directly to our object. And we can always scale that texture because right now it doesn't look like it's taking too much effect on our object. I'm going to bring this up to 3 meters and recalculate. And we'll notice that some areas of our object will not be generating particles. I could also reduce that amount. Go in here and bring this down to 0.4 on all of our axes and recalculate. And we might notice the effect a little bit more. And of course, the more particles we have being generated with our birth rate, the more we're going to notice that texture effect. What we could also do is set up a gradient map. And what I want to do for that is first add in a new object to our scene. And we're going to add in a null. And I want to adjust the position of this null and take a look as it is in relation to our object. And now let's go into the object properties for our emitter and our object. Go to our texture and we're going to change this to a gradient. And now our input parameter is going to be on a distance to object. And what we want is the x distance, which is going to be left and right now, which is basically the motion that our object is traveling. And what we need to set up is the end on the bottom, which is going to be the total amount of meters. So let's change our grid size using the right bracket key in order to bring down our grid a little bit more. And what we can see is we have 10 meters per each of our grid. And we want to adjust the distance between the null and this object. So we need to make sure we have enough of our meters within the end in order to correctly show that. So since we have 10 meters for our grid, we're going to take a look a little bit above the object, and we can see that we have around 1, 2, 3, 4. So about 4 grid spaces, so just around 40 meters. So we would change our end to 40 meters. And I'm going to create another key within our gradient at the end, and our value is going to be set to 0. And that way we have a nice variation. And basically, what I want to do is remove these values. I'm going to have this as a value set to 0 on the first one, and go down to the next key and change that value to 1. We also could invert the layers or invert our keys. And I'm going to hit calculate. And we're really not seeing too much of a change right now. we're going to go back, and we need to make sure that we select our object, of course. So our input parameter, x distance to object, and right now that x distance is not really being defined by anything. So we're going to change our object to that null, and now it will calculate correctly to as it travels by this null object. And what we're seeing is that it'll generate when it's farther away and stop generating particles once it gets close to the object. And we could also reverse that effect. I'm going to go back and change our value to 1, and then this down to 0, and recalculate, and now we're going to see no particles are created until we get close to the null. And we're not seeing a huge birth rate right now, so we need to either adjust the birth rate or adjust our value of the parameter within the gradient. So we're going to select our texture once again, and for our first value and first key, we're going to set this all the way up to 500. And now if I calculate, what we're going to see is that when we're far away from the object, no particles are being created, and once we get closer to it, it's going to start to generate all those particles. So it's a really neat way we can control our generation to be closer to an object. We can also restrict that by doing the exact opposite once again. I can either invert the layer, or I can set the value to 0 in the first and go to the end and set that value to 500. So as we get closer, we're going to generate less particles. And we can take a look and see that showing up, and once we get closer to that object, it generates less particles and then more. And we can see that showing up with a high amount of particles at first, and then once we start getting closer to the object, it's generating less and less, and then it'll start to pick up back again once it gets farther away from that object. And that's based on the distance of the x and how far away it is moving closer to it and farther away. We could also set this on another axis if we're moving in a different direction. And there's just a lot of different things we could do. We can go back into that texture, and we can also set up a distance to camera, which is basically going to work the same way. We could also use previous layer, which could have to do with other gradients or other procedurals or images. So lots we can do to control it. I can set this value a little bit higher if I wanted to, or a little lower. Could set our end to 20 meters, and of course we really don't have a point right now. But we can easily adjust that distance by changing the end amount or increase the distance, and that way we can add more key points and change our overall values. We could also do a little burst where I'll add in another frame or another key section just below the bottom one, where I'll set the value to 0, so it's going to be a very quick effect. And now if I calculate, we'll really see that distance show up, where it's going to generate up until that point and then really cut off and stop. And we could do the exact opposite. Set our top one to a value of 500, drag up this 0 that we have, and also set the bottom one to 0. And then I can calculate that. So now we can see that once it gets close to the object, it's going to start really generating and showing up. We could also control this effect basically in the same way by using a fixed amount. So I'm going to remove this texture, and if we hold down the Shift key and then click on the texture, it will remove it. And that works the same for envelopes as well. I'm going to remove our null from the scene and just clear that out. And we're going to go back to our effects emitter, and once we get to the center, let's say around frame 180, so we'll set fixed start frame at 180, and now if we calculate, we won't see any of our particles until frame 180, and then it starts to span out. So that's another way we could do that. if you wanted to be sort of keyframing it in the overall animation. And what I want to do is just reduce this and turn off our subdivisions. I'm going to turn off fixed, and we're going to go over to Modeler and just hit Tab on the keyboard to remove the sub D, and then switch to Layout. And now we can take a look at a polygon object, or a reduced polygon, because of course sub Ds are still polygons. And I'm going to switch this to our wireframe mode. And we can take a look at some of the other generator options. Let's just take a look at the effects emitter and change the nozzle to vertices. And now it's going to be specifically generating from the vertices of our object, which we can see a little bit better if we zoom in. And if we change that back to surface, we're going to notice it just can take the entire object into account. And then we can do object normal, which is going to generate from each of our polygons, and basically the center of each polygon, or its normal. And if we use object line, we're going to see this is going to work a little bit differently. And basically it's generating from our points, but with the line mode, it is going to condense them a little bit more. And it's going to come out in bursts from specific areas. And I'm just tracking our object now in the perspective view. And we can see that bursting out from our different points. And it really is creating more of a line. And that's just another way we can generate with these different objects. Let's go back to surface, and then of course we are generating from the entire object, but we can also use the other settings as well. I could change this to box, and now it's going to generate from a box within the object. So if you don't want to use the actual surface of the object, but you just want to have the emitter connected to it, coming from it, you can also use the other methods where you can use the sphere, nozzle, cone, also the box. You can change that to cone. You can see that showing up. There's a lot of different things we could do with it. And of course we can still use the parent collision and emitter end, and along with our other collision objects, in order to set up the hierarchy of different particle emitters. And next we're going to take a look at using this same object as a collision object.